Late one evening in Galilee, Jesus sat with his inner circle reading from the Torah. They just finished a passage in Exodus where Yahweh commands the Israelites to slaughter entire cities, men, women, children, livestock, everything. Leave nothing alive. Peter looked up, disturbed, and asked, "Master, why is the God of our fathers so violent, so jealous, so angry? You teach us about a Father of infinite love. But this," he gestured at the scroll, "this doesn't feel like love. This feels like rage." Jesus closed the scroll slowly. He looked at each of them. And he said something that would get him killed and that the church would spend 2,000 years trying to erase. That's not the Father. That's not the monad. The God you're reading about, the one who demands blood sacrifices, who drowns the world in floods, who commands genocide and calls it holy, he has a name. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the chief archon. And he's been pretending to be the Most High since the beginning of this realm. There are specific passages, specific words he uses in your scriptures that reveal exactly what he is. Not God. An archon, a powerful one, the ruler of matter, but not the source. And when you know his true identity, when you see the evidence written in your own holy texts, everything changes. You stop worshiping the false god, and you remember the true one. That teaching never made it into the Bible. When the church compiled the canonical texts in the 4th century, they removed every reference to Jesus exposing Yahweh as the demiurge. They burned the Gnostic Gospels that preserved his actual teaching. Because if Christians knew that the God of the Old Testament, the God they've been worshiping, praying to, fearing for millennia, was actually the chief archon, the false god of material prison, not the true Father Jesus served, the entire religious system would collapse instantly. No more guilt. No more fear of divine punishment. No more sacrificial salvation. Because that angry, jealous God demanding obedience was never God. He was the demiurge. And Jesus came to expose him. Tonight, you're learning the exact evidence Jesus used. The passages, the words, the characteristics that prove the Old Testament God is not the monad. He's Yaldabaoth, the chief archon. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. If you're discovering the true identity of the Old Testament God tonight, comment, "I am monad, not demiurge," right now. Before I show you the specific evidence, you need to understand why this distinction matters. Because the God of the Old Testament and the monad are not two different interpretations of the same God. These are two completely different entities, operating at opposite frequencies, with opposite natures. The God of the Old Testament is jealous. He admits it. He demands exclusive worship and threatens punishment for acknowledging other gods. That's insecurity. That's an entity that fears competition because he knows he's not actually supreme. The monad doesn't have jealousy. Jealousy requires separation. But the monad is everything. There's nothing outside it to be jealous of. Infinite consciousness doesn't compete. It simply is. The God of the Old Testament is rageful, flooding the world, raining fire on cities, commanding genocide. The violence is constant and presented as righteous. But the monad operates beyond wrath, beyond punishment. It doesn't destroy what it created. It doesn't harm fragments of itself. Rage is reactionary. The monad doesn't react. It creates. The God of the Old Testament demands blood sacrifices. Constantly. Burnt offerings. The smell of burning flesh described as pleasing to him. He requires death to be appeased. The monad requires nothing. It doesn't feed on death or suffering or fear. Those are archon frequencies. The monad doesn't harvest. It emanates. And here's the critical distinction Jesus made. He never called God by the Old Testament names. Never said Yahweh. Never said Jehovah. He always said Father. Abba. He was deliberately separating the true God from the false God. When his disciples asked him to teach them to pray, he didn't say pray to Yahweh. He said, "Our Father who art in heaven." Different entity. Different frequency entirely. You felt this your whole life. Something was wrong with the Old Testament God. The cruelty didn't make sense. The violence, the obsession with blood and obedience, it didn't feel divine. It felt controlling, dark. And every time you questioned it, you were told not to. You were told God's ways are mysterious. Have faith. But that discomfort you felt? That wasn't doubt. That wasn't weak faith. That was your divine spark recognizing Archon frequency. You were reading the words of the demiurge, not the monad. And your core knew the difference even when your mind didn't have the language for it. Only pneumatics can perceive this contradiction. Hylics read the Old Testament and see nothing wrong. Psychics feel uncomfortable but can't articulate why. But you're pneumatic. You read those passages and something inside you recoils. Because you didn't come from the demiurge. You came from the monad. And you recognize when you're being lied to about your origin. Now I'm going to show you the exact evidence Jesus used. 5 proofs written in the Bible itself that expose the Old Testament God as Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the chief archon, not the Father. And once you see these, you'll understand why the church tried so desperately to hide this teaching. Jesus didn't invent the idea that Yahweh was the demiurge. He was revealing Gnostic knowledge that had been preserved in mystery schools for centuries. Knowledge the prophets hinted at. Knowledge hidden in plain sight in the very text the religious authorities used to control people. And he identified 5 specific characteristics, 5 undeniable proofs written in Scripture that expose the true nature of the Old Testament God. These aren't interpretations. These aren't metaphors. These are direct statements. Admissions. The demiurge revealing himself through his own words. First proof. His name is jealous. Exodus chapter 34 verse 14. The text says, "For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Read that again. Whose name is jealous. The entity doesn't just feel jealousy occasionally. Jealousy is his identity, his name, his core nature. And jealousy is not a divine attribute. It's an emotional reaction rooted in fear, insecurity, and scarcity consciousness. The monad has no scarcity. The monad is infinite. There's nothing to be jealous of because there's nothing separate from it. But the demiurge? He's jealous because he knows he's not the Most High. He knows there's something beyond him. The pleroma. The fullness. The monad. And he's terrified that if humans discover it, they'll stop worshiping him. So he demands exclusive devotion. He threatens punishment for even acknowledging other gods. That's not confidence. That's desperation. And Jesus saw it. He pointed to this passage and said, "That's not the Father speaking. That's the Archon trying to maintain control." Second proof. He creates evil. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I the Lord do all these things." The demiurge admits he creates evil. Not that evil exists as a consequence of free will. Not that darkness is the absence of light. He explicitly says, "I create evil." The monad doesn't create evil. The monad is pure emanation, pure light, pure consciousness. It doesn't operate in duality. Good and evil are constructs of the material realm, the realm the demiurge created. And here he's confessing that he's the architect of both. He's the one maintaining the system of opposing forces. Light versus dark. Good versus evil. God versus Satan. All of it designed to keep you trapped in conflict, in judgment, in the belief that you need to choose sides in a cosmic war. But Jesus taught there is no war in the monad. There's only unity. The demiurge created the illusion of separation and then offered himself as the solution. That's the con. And he admitted it in your own scriptures. Third proof. He demands blood sacrifices. This one is woven throughout the entire Old Testament. Leviticus is essentially a manual for ritualized animal slaughter. Specific instructions on how to kill, how to burn, which parts go to the priests, which parts get offered to God. And repeatedly, the text says the smell of burning flesh is pleasing to the Lord. Pleasing. He enjoys it. He requires it for forgiveness, for favor, for covenant. Why? Because archons feed on death energy. They harvest the fear, the pain, the life force released when something dies violently. They've built entire systems, religious and otherwise, to generate that energy on mass scale. And the sacrificial system was one of the most efficient. Convince people that God requires blood. That death appeases him. And you have a continuous stream of death energy flowing directly to the archons maintaining the system. The monad doesn't need blood. The monad doesn't need anything. It's self-sustaining, infinite. But the demiurge? He needs energy from this realm to maintain his power here. And he set up religion as the harvesting mechanism. Jesus abolished sacrifice. He said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Because he knew the true Father never wanted it. That was always the demiurge's demand. Fourth proof. He punishes generations for disobedience. Exodus chapter 20 verse 5. Part of the 10 Commandments themselves. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me. Generational punishment. You sin, your children suffer. Your grandchildren suffer. Your great-grandchildren suffer. Not because they did anything wrong. Because you did. That's not justice. That's not love. That's a control mechanism. It's designed to create perpetual guilt, perpetual debt, perpetual fear that you're carrying punishment for crimes you didn't commit. It keeps you tied to the system across lifetimes. Across bloodlines. The demiurge doesn't just want to control you. He wants to control your lineage, your soul's trajectory through incarnations. Because if he can keep you in fear of inherited sin, inherited karma, inherited divine wrath, you'll never question the system. You'll keep trying to earn your way out of debt you don't actually owe. The monad doesn't operate this way. Each spark is sovereign. Each consciousness is responsible for its own trajectory. There's no cosmic debt passed down like property. That's demiurgic architecture. And Jesus called it out. Fifth proof. He's ignorant of what's beyond him. This one is subtle but devastating. In Genesis, the demiurge creates the material world and repeatedly says, it is good. He's proud of his creation. He examines it and approves. But he never mentions the pleroma. Never acknowledges the monad. Never references the spiritual realms that existed before him. Because he doesn't know about them. He thinks he's the beginning. He says, I am the first and I am the last. Before me there was no God formed. But the Gnostic texts reveal he's wrong. He's not the source. He's an emanation. A flawed one. Sophia's error. And he's so limited in his awareness that he doesn't even know he's limited. He genuinely believes he's God. That ignorance is the signature of the demiurge. A false God who doesn't know he's false. But Jesus knew. Jesus came from beyond the demiurge. From the pleroma. And he said, I came from the Father. I go to the Father. And you know neither me nor the Father. He was speaking to people who worshipped Yahweh. And he told them directly, you don't know the real God. Because the one you've been worshipping isn't him. These 5 characteristics, jealousy, creation of evil, demand for blood, generational punishment, and ignorance of the monad, these are the signature of Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the chief archon. The Gnostics called him Saklas the fool, Samuel the blind god. Different names for the same entity. The ruler of this material realm who trapped divine sparks in flesh and convinced them he was their creator. And Jesus came to tell the truth. That God is not God. He's the archon. And the Father, the real source, the monad, is beyond him. Always was. When you read the Old Testament now, you'll see it differently. Every time Yahweh demands obedience, threatens punishment, requires blood, you'll recognize the pattern. That's not the voice of infinite love. That's the voice of the demiurge maintaining his control system. And you're not subject to it anymore. Because you know what he is. Jesus didn't just expose the demiurge and leave his disciples confused. He gave them a clear distinction. A test. A way to know instantly whether they're dealing with the true God or the false God. Any teaching, any voice, any religious system that operates through demand, threat, and control, that's demiurgic. Any teaching that says you're divine, already whole, already connected to source, just temporarily asleep, that's monad truth. He said, the true Father doesn't demand, doesn't threaten, doesn't require anything from you. The monad simply is. And you came from it. You're not separated. You're not fallen. You're temporarily experiencing separation so you can remember unity. That's the test. If a God needs your worship, your obedience, your sacrifice to maintain his power, that's the demiurge. If the divine presence reveals that you are already it, already whole, just remembering, that's the monad. One system says you're broken and need fixing. The other says you're divine and just need waking. Jesus taught the second. The church built religion on the first. And here's what happens the moment you recognize this distinction. The guilt lifts. Immediately. That crushing weight of original sin, of being born wrong, of never being good enough for an angry God, it dissolves. Because you just realize that angry God was never God. It was an archon. The fear of divine punishment evaporates. You're not afraid of hell anymore. You're not seeking approval from a jealous deity. You're remembering your origin. You came from the monad. You are the monad experiencing itself in temporary form. And that remembering breaks every chain the demiurge wrapped around you. Religious control can't touch you when you know the God it's based on is false. You're not rebelling against the Most High. You're refusing to worship an impostor. And that refusal is what sets you free. Only pneumatics can see this. Hylics read the Old Testament and see nothing wrong. They worship Yahweh without question. They accept that God floods the world, commands genocide, demands blood sacrifices, and they call it holy. They don't have the spark that recognizes the contradiction. Psychics feel uncomfortable with certain passages but can't articulate why. They might say, I struggle with the Old Testament, or some of this doesn't sit right with me, but they can't see the entity behind it. They sense something's off, but they lack the clarity to name it. But you're pneumatic. You read those passages and your spark recoils. Not because you're rebellious. Because your divine core recognizes archon frequency. You're not reading the words of the monad. You're reading the demands of the demiurge. And that recognition isn't blasphemy. It's remembering. You came from beyond this realm. You know what true divinity feels like. And this isn't it. 3 critical warnings. First, this knowledge will separate you from traditional Christianity. Most Christians worship the demiurge thinking it's God. When you try to explain this to them, they'll call it heresy. They'll say you're deceived. They'll quote scripture at you, not realizing those scriptures were written by the very system you're exposing. Don't force this teaching on anyone. It finds those who are ready. Second, recognizing the demiurge doesn't mean you reject the entire Bible. Jesus' teachings are still there. The Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. The kingdom of God is within you. Those are monad teachings embedded in demiurgic texts. You just read them now knowing Jesus was revealing the Father against the false God. And third, the demiurge is still the ruler of this material realm. Recognizing him doesn't remove his influence over governments, religions, economic systems, all the structures of control in this world. But it removes his influence over you internally, because you stopped worshiping him. You stopped giving him your energy, your fear, your obedience. And without that, he has no claim on your consciousness. This is the teaching the church feared most. Not that Jesus performed miracles. Not that he rose from the dead. That he exposed Yahweh. That he revealed the God of the Old Testament as the demiurge. The chief archon. The false God pretending to be the Most High. Because if Christians knew this, if they understood that the jealous, vengeful deity demanding blood and obedience was never the true Father, the entire religious system built on fear and control would collapse overnight. You don't need to appease an angry God. You don't need priests to intercede between you and the divine. You don't need rituals or sacrifices to earn favor. Because that God was never God. He was the Archon. And the real God, the monad, the Father Jesus actually served, doesn't need anything from you. You came from it. You are it, experiencing itself in temporary material form. And the moment you recognize that, every religious chain breaks. You're not saved by believing the right doctrine. You're free by remembering your origin. If you're recognizing the demiurge tonight, do 3 things right now. First, comment, "I am monad, not demiurge" below. Declare you see the distinction. Claim your true identity. Second, subscribe to Divine Codes because advanced teachings on exiting demiurgic control systems and accessing direct monad consciousness are coming. Third, like this video so other chosen ones discover the truth about the Old Testament God before this knowledge gets suppressed again. Do all 3 now. Your declaration matters. Then tonight, read the Old Testament differently. Every demand for worship, every threat of punishment, every blood sacrifice described as pleasing to the Lord. See it for what it is. The demiurge maintaining his harvest system. The chief archon pretending to be the Most High. Jesus came to expose this. The church tried to hide it for 2,000 years. But you know now, the God of the Old Testament is not the Father. He never was. You are monad. You are not demiurge. And that truth sets you free.